Thank you very much, Lauren. As the late impresario Saul Urich said, it's so nice to hear your eulogy while you're still alive. And for those running for office, I commend you, especially those who kept their remarks under 2 minutes, which is just about the time it took Abraham Lincoln to deliver his 272 words at Gettysburg. Keeping in mind that the other person on the podium, Edward Everett, spoke for 2.5 hours. Well, I wasn't really sure what kind of a greeting I would get coming from Rhode Island to Connecticut, especially since when Virginia and I walked in the front door, just before the front door, the shrubbery had covered the top name, or the middle name. It said Dump Williams. And I want to assure you my first name is Frank, and that we're not related. You know, I've been studying, believe this or not, I've been studying Abraham Lincoln since I was 11 years old. I was in the 6th grade in public schools in Cranston, Rhode Island, and I sat under this engraving of this man called Lincoln, and I was taken with that pine cone face. And my teacher, we really remember our great teachers, don't we? And she saw this interest and helped persuade me to continue the study of Lincoln and our country, our special country. And Lincoln would be very happy here tonight, because after all, he was a politician first before he was a lawyer. And he understood the nature of our political system and the freedoms that needed to be protected. It's why, isn't it, he chose war instead of surrender when states seceded, even before he was inaugurated our 16th president on March 4, 1861. So I want to pick up, though, at midstream in 1863-64, because we are commemorating the 150th anniversary. And I want to start with Gettysburg. The word is a looking glass for America. Not even Abraham Lincoln could fix Gettysburg for all time. It now drives us, this commemoration, to peer again into the glass, to reflect anew upon a moment when the American future hung uncertainly in the humid Pennsylvania air, when yet another Confederate victory, especially one on Union soil, might have broken the Lincoln administration's grip on power. After the Battle of Chancellorsville, won by Robert E. Lee and his Army of Northern Virginia, General Lee determined to push into Pennsylvania, where his army might feed off the rich farms and where he hoped a display of the Confederate ability to take the war deep into the Union would encourage the anti-war movement in the North. And there was a great anti-war movement in the North. It was General John Buford, head of the Army of the Potomac Cavalry and a former member of my own cavalry regiment, the 2nd. We didn't serve at the same time. Who was responsible for there being a battle at Gettysburg. By reconnaissance in force on the west and north of the town, he and his men held their place against attacking Confederates until General George Meade could seize the high ground east and south of the town of Gettysburg. By the end of July 1st, Lee's army was able to clear the advanced force of the Army of the Potomac out of Gettysburg, but Union soldiers were still holding on to strategic points south of the town. By July 3, Lee had planned to achieve a knockout blow by sending 3 divisions of infantry straight into the apex of the Union's army's line just behind Cemetery Hill, where they were greeted by several Rhode Island and Connecticut regiments. While the Confederates broke through, they were forced back. Shocked at his failure and the terrible cost in lives, Lee ordered a retreat back across the Potomac. "The campaign is a failure, and the worst failure that the South has ever made," wrote one Confederate survivor. A soldier in the 11th Georgia Regiment wrote his mother that the Army is brokenhearted and now don't care which way the war closes, for we have suffered very much. In fact, Lee would never again be able to take the military initiative. While fighting would go on for another 21 months, the Confederates would conduct defensive warfare which they could least afford. We cannot come to terms with the Civil War because it presents us with an unacceptable kind of self-knowledge. We think, as Americans, that we possess a heroic past, and we like to think of our history as one of progress and the spread of freedom. But the Civil War tells us that we possess a tragic history instead, over which we must continually hope. Hope, Rhode Island's motto. The stream of blood that started at Fort Sumter passed through Gettysburg, Reconstruction, and into the Civil Rights era, right down to the present. It's worth recalling the reasons that the Civil War era endures. The Civil War isn't just an adjunct to current events. It's a national reserve of words and images and landscapes. A storehouse we can tap in lean times like these, when many Americans feel diminished, divided, and starved for civility more nourishing than the bloviating commentators. 150 years later, it is more relevant than ever. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, so we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. Those famous lines come from President Lincoln, delivered not in the Gettysburg Address, but on a routine occasion, his second annual message to Congress. Can you recall a single line from any of the teleprompted State of the Union messages, including the one this last Tuesday in your own lifetime? The Civil War abounded in eloquence, from the likes of Frederick Douglass, Walt Whitman, the Southern diarist Mary Chestnut, and warriors who spoke the way they fought. Consider the Southern cavalryman Jeb Stuart with panache saying about his father-in-law's loyalty to the Union, "He will regret it but once, and that will be continually." Or General William Tecumseh Sherman, brutal and terse, warning besieged Atlantans, "You cannot qualify war in harsher terms than I will. War is cruelty, and you cannot define it." These and other words from the war convey a bracing candor and individuality, traits Americans reflexively extol while rarely exhibiting. Today's general officers would never declare, as Sherman said, "I can make this march and make Georgia howl," or say of a superior, as Sherman did of General Ulysses S. Grant, He stood by me when I was crazy, and I stood by him when he was drunk. You can hear the same bold voice in the writing of common soldiers, their letters unmuzzled by military censors, and their dialect not yet homogenized by television. Got to see the elephant at last, an Indianan wrote of his first inglorious combat. I don't care about seeing him very often anymore, for if there was any fun in such work, I couldn't see it. It is not the thing it is bragged up to be. Another soldier called the Gettysburg Campaign nothing but fighting, starving, marching, and cussing. Cowards were known as skedaddlers, tree dodgers, skulkers, and croakers. No president has such a hold on our minds as Abraham Lincoln. He lived at the dawn of photography, and his pine cone face made a haunting picture. He was the best writer in all of American politics, and his words are even more powerful than his images. His greatest trial, the Civil War, was the nation's greatest trial, and the race problem that caused it is still with us today. His death by murder gave his life a poignant and violent climax, and allows us to play the always fascinating game of what if. It is not by chance that one of Lincoln's best speeches was delivered on a battlefield on the occasion of dedicating a cemetery for those who fought, died, and were buried there. We remember. Lincoln said that the brave men, living and dead, who struggled on this ground, this battlefield, had consecrated it better than he or anyone else could. Their cause was great and noble. We also remember Lincoln saying that their work was unfinished, and that we, the living, should highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of, by, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. We remember everything he said, and we remember it because he took great pains to say things beautifully. Lincoln's few brief remarks, all 272 words, set forth Lincoln's view that the fundamental significance of Gettysburg and the Civil War was the survival of democracy itself, when he said, whether any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. In 1863, democracy did not look like it could survive for long, as democracies are run by the consent of the governed. This is assuming that the most ordinary citizens are competent to engage in governing. Is this so? People can be mean, selfish, and allow government to become dysfunctional when money, self-interest, and incompetence are involved. To Lincoln and its dead, wounded, and missing were proof that many of these citizens were willing to make the ultimate sacrifice to preserve the solidarity of our nation. He could not look out across the semicircular rows of dead in that cemetery, where fully a quarter of the 3,900 buried there were unknowns, and not feel confident about the endurance of democracy. He asked all Americans to dedicate themselves to that cause for which the dead at Gettysburg gave the last full measure of devotion. While Gettysburg had great military significance, it became even more because how Abraham Lincoln morphed this horrible battle, 51,000 casualties, into an ode for democracy. We also remember his second inaugural address, especially the concluding paragraph, the poignant beauty of it. with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. 6 weeks later, he was murdered. We say that a man can be known by the company he keeps. A nation can be known and judged by its heroes, whom it honors above all others. We pay ourselves the greatest compliment when we say that Abraham Lincoln is that man for us. So we commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Civil War with fanfare and reverence. At the end of the war, Americans faced a formidable challenge: how to memorialize 750,000 dead, North and South. As Walt Whitman mused, it was the dead, our South, our North, ours all, that preoccupied the country. After all, the same number of Americans per capita had died in Vietnam as died in the Civil War. 4 million names would be on the Vietnam Veterans Memorial instead of 58,000. This is an extremely timely reminder that the American experiment, as the founders asserted, has not been a self-evident truth, but in fact a highly debatable proposition that needed to be proved, not just in July 1863 at Gettysburg, but on many days and in many places since. Lincoln would state that in time of war, blood grows hot and blood is spilled, confidence dies, and universal suspicion reigns. Woven throughout the fabric of American history are the very personal stories of soldiers who risked and even gave their lives to preserve the blessed freedom Americans covet. Why do men, now men and women, fight? For some, it was a show of patriotism or political conviction. For others, military service was born of a love of adventure or a want of employment. When asked for his opinion about why men were willing to fight a war, Civil War hero Joshua Chamberlain of the 20th Maine said, "Simple manhood, force of discipline, love or bond of comradeship. Most of all, though, it was the trust that each man had that the others, especially those on either side of him, would not run." Thrice wounded Civil War veteran Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. later went on to become a Justice of the United States Supreme Court. Years later, in speaking at a Memorial Day banquet, he said of his fellow Civil War veterans, "In our youth, our hearts were touched with fire." As we continue on the now well-worn path of life, let us hold on to a bit of that fire and carry in our hearts and souls the love of liberty for which we fought so many years ago. And what is the answer? One Roman general 2,000 years ago said, "Si vis pacem para bellum." If you wish peace, prepare for war. It is a bottomless treasure, this Civil War, much of it encrusted in myth or still unexplored, which is why a century and a half later, it still claims our attention. May God bless each of you and our beloved country. Thank you very much.